Good afternoon, everybody. I'm just going to give it a few seconds while everybody filters in before we make a start. So just 30 seconds or so to let everybody get themselves in. Okay, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Karen Bond. I'm a BCVA board member and working with the Ruminant Health and Welfare Group on BTV-3. And I'm really pleased to welcome you on behalf of BCVA and the Ruminant Health and Welfare Group to the latest in this series of BTV-3 technical webinars. Please note this webinar will be recorded and the recording will be circulated within 24 hours after this webinar. I'm going to start today with a small update on the current situation, both here in the UK and in Europe. As you know, we're now in the high-risk vector period with temperatures, even though it might not feel like it at the moment, approaching the range where it would allow multiplication of the virus in midges, and that's certainly the situation in Europe, even if not here at the moment. APHA have received notifications of suspect cases, but thus far these have all proven to not be BTV-3, so they have all been ruled out. So thus far, no confirmed cases. However, we would encourage any farmers and vets with any suspicions that they see animals affected with BTV to report this immediately. This is a notifiable disease, and if it does arrive here in the UK, then the quicker we know about it, obviously the better. If you want more information on the clinical signs or details of how to report those suspect cases, this can be found on the bluetongue resource page of the Ruminant Health and Welfare website. And really, for any information you're looking for on BTV-3, that really is the best place to start. There's lots of information on that page itself, and then there's lots of links through to other useful resources as well. So not much to report here in the UK at the moment. So if we move now on to Europe, at the time of recording this webinar on the 12th of June, there have been no confirmed cases of BTV-3 in Belgium, Germany or the Netherlands. But obviously we are early in the vector risk season, and it would be likely to be the end of this month or into July really before we would be likely to see anything. 2 vaccines have been granted emergency authorisation in the Netherlands and 1 in Belgium, and vaccination began in those countries in May. As yet, we clearly have no data on the efficacy of these vaccines as it's just too early, and obviously we've not seen any reported cases yet. It's worth noting that there are currently no vaccines authorised for use here in the UK. We do hope that the intensive vaccination campaigns in Belgium and the Netherlands will decrease midge infection and so reduce the likelihood of any of the midges that do get blown across into the UK being BTV infected. So hopefully the work they're doing over there will be of help to us. Now clearly things may change quite quickly, and we will do our best to keep you informed of any developments in Europe or here in the UK via the Ruminant Health and Welfare Group website and the BTV page that's on there, and of course through future webinars. So please do keep an eye on the website for those updates and also for future webinars. So if I come now on to the purpose of today's webinar. As you'll be aware, the government set out their BTV-3 control framework on the 23rd of May. And this framework is going to be outlined today in this webinar, and we're delighted to have Gordon Hickman from DEFRA here to give a presentation on this framework. Now, before I introduce Gordon and hand over to him for this presentation, do just want to do a little bit of housekeeping and give you an idea of how today's webinar is going to work. So as you will all be aware, shortly after the release of the BTV framework, a general election was announced. What you may be less familiar with are the restrictions this places on discussions around government policy. This period is known as the pre-election period of sensitivity, or you may more commonly have heard of it referred to as PERDA. During this time, there are restrictions in place around discussion of government policy, how it might be implemented in future, and what future policy might look like. So clearly that places us in a slightly strange situation with our webinar today, talking about that BTV-3 framework. So what does that actually mean for how today's webinar is going to work? Well, Gordon's going to outline the framework and its contents. And then what will happen is any questions that you put through to us, he will try to answer those that are operational and that he feels able to do so. But he's not going to be able to answer questions around policy, around that implementation or future structure. Doesn't mean he doesn't want to answer questions, and it doesn't mean that those questions aren't important. So we would still really like to encourage you to submit as many questions as you have using the chat question function that you have available to you. So please put those through, as many questions as you have. All of the questions that are submitted today will be collated and passed through to DEFRA, especially those that Gordon is unable to answer. DEFRA really welcome those questions and they're really keen to see what's being asked. They can then work on responses and comms, which we will be able to feed back to you via the Ruminant Health and Welfare Group website and perhaps future webinars. But just to note that this won't be able to happen until after the general election. So Gordon will answer what he can, but I hope that you respect the position that he's in today. And you know, we felt it was still really important to have this webinar and get that outline and those operational questions answered. We want you to be as fully informed as you possibly can, and be assured that we will continue to try to keep you up to date as best we can. So questions, please submit them via the chat function, as many as you've got. As I say, those regarding the policy, we will pass to DEFRA, and Gordon will do his best to answer any operational ones. If you've got any technical questions regarding the disease itself, then we're also really pleased today to have Gareth Haitley on the webinar. And he'll be here to answer those technical questions around the disease. For those of you who don't know Gareth, he's a past president of the BCVA and he's worked for many years for APHA, and while there was the lead of their cattle expert group, and he has particular expertise in disease surveillance, so perfect person to answer those questions for you today. Okay, so after what has been a seriously long introduction from your chair, and I apologise for that, I would now like to introduce and welcome our speaker for today, Gordon Hickman. Gordon is Head of Exotic Disease Control for DEFRA, where he's responsible for policy and legislation for exotic notifiable diseases of animals, new and emerging disease threats and surveillance policy. This includes policy preparedness and response to disease outbreaks such as bluetongue and avian influenza. So just a small job there that Gordon has. We're really grateful for him agreeing to come and speak today, especially during this pre-election period, and he's going to give a great presentation and hopefully be able to answer some of the questions that you've got. Thank you very much, Gordon. I'll pass over to you.
Can you hear me, guys? Yep, perfect. Well, good afternoon, everyone, and thanks for inviting me back. Always good to be invited back to these webinars, and Karen set out perhaps what I can and can't say. Today I'm just going to perhaps go over some of the background to how we got to the framework. Just a reminder that the framework only applies in England. As you know, animal health and welfare policy is devolved, and we have slightly different legislative and policy frameworks in each of the administrations. So I can really only speak on behalf of England. I forget which number of webinars this is, but you should all know this by now. In terms, Karen has sort of basically given an overview. And in particular, the fact that there aren't any authorised vaccines for bluetongue 3 yet. Again, you know this, but it's really just a reminder that we first detected bluetongue on the 10th of November in Kent. Over the winter period, we put in place those 2 temporary control zones. There was no evidence of ongoing circulation of virus in the midge population, and then we entered the seasonally vector low period on the 8th of January, much later than we expected, and now we're in the vector active period again, because it warmed up a bit too soon on the 18th of March. So we're now in an active vector period. So that means vectors are very active. It just means that the temperature as such is that the onward risk of transmission in GB is still quite low because we haven't had those cumulative temperatures. But as Karen said, those temperature thresholds have been achieved in the Netherlands, Belgium, Germany and parts of France. So if disease is there, if it has overwintered, then there is an ongoing risk of ongoing transmission on the continent. And so once that starts circulating, we get that risk of transmission over here. And in total, we had 126 infected animals on 73 different premises. So if you compare our 73 with the numbers in the Netherlands, you can see the relative proportion of that. So Karen's mentioned the Netherlands and Germany. The Netherlands had a total last year of just over 6,000 cases, of which about 26% had clinical signs. And those dots on the top are the red ones are if you like, those that were detected by surveillance, by lab results, and the blue ones are the clinical cases. I think it's just worth reminding ourselves that in the first 8 weeks of them finding disease in early September, they had over 5,000 cases. And if that were maintained over a 21-week period, i.e. if we had disease from the 1st of June and through to the end of October, that could be 14,000 detected premises of an equivalent sort of size. So that just sort of shows the sort of speed at which it spread throughout the Netherlands. In Germany, there's a map there. I think the first case was on and around the 12th of October. I think they've had 98 cases. Whilst there's been no formal reports of active disease anywhere in Northern Ireland, as Karen said, there is one shown on the FLI website from the 7th of June, which is not closed and is still active. And it's this pink one here. So it is just possible that is the first case this year, but that hasn't been confirmed, but it's still on the website as being active and not closed. So we may just be at the start of the season, so even more reason to be aware and alert. So I mean, what can we expect this year? The straight answer is none of us really know, but we've, in preparation for it, we've done modelling, we've done epidemiological assessments. On the screen there, you'll see we published a risk assessment for the likelihood of BTV-3 and BTV-8 incursions into Great Britain. I say we, APHA did that, working with Pirbright, and that's concluded that there is a very high risk that we'll get at least one incursion of BTV-3 during 2024. What we do is we work with the Met Office, and they've got a model called the NAME model, which is an atmospheric dispersion model. And if you take a number of sites along the coast of from Denmark down through France, you can then looking at temperatures and wind profiles, you can make some estimates of the likelihood of an incursion. So the wind's got to be blowing in the right direction. It's got to be not raining, because that tends to wash midges out of the plumes. And of course, you've got to have active disease ongoing in the continent. And that picture on the extreme right hand side, the coloured model showed the sort of the highest risk counties. And over the course of a year, you can add up the number of incursions or potential incursions from those different areas and sort of get a risk profile. So Kent is generally speaking the highest risk because it catches it both from France and from the Netherlands and Germany going across. So the darker the colour, the higher the risk. The southernmost counties tend to be at highest risk from France, from northern France. The easternmost counties are at highest risk from Belgium and the Netherlands. So at the moment, we haven't got any BTV-3 in France. So our high-risk counties at the moment are those eastern coast counties, Norfolk down to East Sussex. So we're doing that modelling and those assessments. And Pirbright have a model, and we've played around with some scenarios to look at what might happen. I think these is really just a sort of a summary of the headlines. So the earlier we get I mean, a lot of this is fairly obvious. The earlier you get an incursion, the bigger the likelihood of the outbreak is. And you can range from, sort of, if you run a load of modeling iterations, if you take the 90th percentile, that we take that as being the realistic worst case scenario. So if you had an incursion in May on the East Coast and you don't have any movement controls, we might expect to see up to 16,000 farms with some form of clinical disease. Yet if it only appears in July, it may only be as high as 3,500. Still big numbers though. But remember, that's not a prediction. It's the realistic worst case scenario. Again, this is fairly obvious, but the more you put in place movement restrictions around that first incursion, the slower the spread of disease. You can't stop it totally without vaccination, because it's midge borne and midges travel, they move, and so you will get gradual spread even with very strong movement restrictions. But you can limit the size of an outbreak by putting movement restrictions in place. We also expect that if you get an early incursion, it may take a bit of time before you first see those clinical signs, before you first see clinical disease being present, assuming we see it at all. So if it had arrived on the 1st of May, it's possible we wouldn't actually see it in an animal for a couple of months. So that's why it's important that we are particularly vigilant about looking for those unusual signs and to report it through. And that's why we've also offered the free testing in those high-risk counties. Irrespective of when it arrives, the worst period for new cases is always going to be in September, October, whatever the modelling says. And we're expecting somewhere between 25 and 30% of farms to show clinical signs. Even in the Netherlands, where I showed you those figures, something only 26% of farms had clinical signs. I'm not going to dwell on these. These are just some maps from the realistic worst case scenario. So this is the 90th percentile. On the extreme right hand side is where you have stringent control zones, much like we had before, perhaps with protection zones and surveillance zones. The left hand side is if you don't have any zones at all, you allow animals to move wherever and you allow it to spread. So it just sort of shows the benefit of movement control zones as you go forward. And the bottom thing is where it arrives later in the year. So just I'm a very visual person. Obviously, the lighter the colour, the more disease you've got. So, again, this is well known to all of you. But in terms of disease control, firstly, we want to find it as soon as we can. But early detection of this disease, particularly with very low clinical signs, is just about impossible to do without testing every animal every week. So we are reliant on passive surveillance. We are reliant on vets and farmers looking for those unusual clinical signs, and Karen's already flagged to where you can look for them. And remember, a test is only as good as the test that you take it at. So there's no point just doing a whole survey and then leaving it. Obviously, taking out vectors is ideal, but there are billions of these things, so there's only so much you can do. But there are things you can do. So if you are moving animals around the countryside, firstly, do a free test if you're in those high-risk counties, and secondly, you can treat the vehicle to reduce the risk of hitchhiking vectors or a midge being transported with it. So you can do some things to minimize that, and we've spoken in the past at other webinars about disease repellents and insecticides. Obviously, you want to reduce the infectious burden. So if we were to catch it very early in the season, so those first few cases, or if we caught it very late in the year and we had been lucky enough not to have any outbreaks, we might do some limited culling. But we're not going to be culling anywhere near the number of animals that we culled in the last time round, because that was a very different set of circumstances. If we get disease, obviously we don't want to move infected animals, so any movement controls would involve pre and post movement testing, unless they were going to slaughter. And obviously the ideal scenario is to have a safe and efficacious vaccine that trading partners are happy to accept. So those are the normal principles of disease control, and we've used those when coming up, along with that modelling work, to come up with our framework. Is this going to let me move on? Oops. This I think I've probably covered, but on a weekly basis we're looking at that risk of incursion, and we're hoping that we'll be able to start publishing these weekly assessments in the coming weeks. And that map on the right is just the locations where we do vector monitoring, vector trapping. It's not particularly relevant now. It's more particularly important in the back end of the season and the beginning of the year, when we're working out when the surveillance, the active period is. I've been through this before with you, but just a reminder, the options for zones are a control zone, usually not more than 20 kilometers, and a restricted zone, which could be as much as 150 kilometers. We're very unlikely to put in place zones of anything like that size if we get disease early on in the season, and we might further split the restricted zone into a protection zone and a surveillance zone, although again that's not our current proposals as set out in the framework, but we reserve the right to do that. And then the rest of the country we call a free area, although as you know we have lost country freedom, so technically speaking, from a trade perspective, none of the UK is formally recognised as free. We've also looked at the livestock movement data, and I'm giving you this just by way of background to explain the sort of the process that we've gone through to try and get to this framework. So if you've got a typical 50-kilometre zone, you might have 3,600 premises, and they might move 7,000 animals to live per month. If you look at those 5 high-risk counties, 12,500 premises moving 18,300 animals to live per month. And if you put in place one of those 150-kilometre zones, 15,500 premises with 30,000 animals to move. So firstly, that just sort of shows the impact on farmers and keepers in those zones and in those areas if we bang them up and put them under total movement restrictions. It also shows the sort of numbers of tests and moves that we might have to license, but it also shows just how many animals do move around the countryside And if if you're moving 18,500 animals per month, that's 18,500 potential infected animals that are moving. So it just shows the sheer scale of animal movements and the balance that we have in terms of managing disease control versus managing the impact on farmers. Now, clearly, if you've got really bad clinical disease and production losses, there's a lot more to be gained from those movement restrictions. If you're seeing no clinical signs at all, like we saw at the back end of last year, the impact of disease controls are worse than the disease itself. And so we have to balance that. And of course, we don't know what it's going to be until we've got it. So our principle is go in hard and then ease back, because if you don't do that, you've lost the battle before you even started. So that will be our principles. So we've mentioned the framework. It's on gov.uk. I'm sure you've all read it, but I'll just give you a high level flavour of it. So it takes us through an outbreak in terms of before, during, and as an outbreak gets bigger. So the first thing is, before we've knowingly got disease, we offer free testing in those high risk counties. And I'll tell you a little bit more about that in a subsequent slide. We've now switched that on. That was switched on back end of last week. So farmers in those high risk counties are now able to apply for a free test. That's only currently available for animals moving to live outside of those zones to manage demand and lab capacity. We will look to contain disease when we first find it. Now, if we're lucky and we detect it early and it's on a coastal location, we're likely to put in place a 20-kilometre control zone. So that's one of those CZs, one of those inner ones. If we detect it, the first detection is some way inland, or we detect several of them, then we're likely to put in place bigger zones, probably around about 50 kilometres, but we will be guided by the epidemiology and the time of the year. And there will be movement restrictions within those zones. On a CZ, that smaller zone, we will allow movements within that zone, but they will be under license. But any movements out of a zone will need to be licensed, and unless they're moving to moving to direct to slaughter at a designated abattoir, there will need to be pre and post movement testing. So we'll look to contain disease early on. We'll then monitor the impact of that disease. What are the clinical presentations, how is it spreading, etc., etc. So we'll allow movements subject to testing. APHA have developed a much better licensing system now, so you can apply online, and it will retain the information that you've put in from previous licenses. And those of you that also have poultry or have clients of the poultry, it's a very similar system to the avian influenza licensing system. So it'll be much easier to apply for licenses. Then we'll monitor the situation and work with our core group and be very transparent with those triggers for scaling up and down. So if we start getting numerous detections, so obviously each new detection will put in place a zone around it of either 20 or 50 kilometers, and if zones overlap, then those zones will merge. But there will come a point when we decide that actually we'll put in place perhaps regional zones, or even an England-wide zone, or in discussion with Wales and Scotland, it could even be a GB-wide zone. And there'll be those sort of triggers, and those triggers will be around the number of cases and the impact of the disease on production and animal welfare compared with the impact of disease of those movement restrictions. and then we want to focus our effort on vaccine development and deployment. Now, there's probably less I can say in the vaccine space because of pre-election periods and things like that. So I certainly can't talk about any future policy on vaccine deployment or whether or not we might have emergency use, etc. But I do have a slide on vaccination. But I want to stress that we will always be guided by the veterinary and epidemiological evidence at the time to guide us. So a bit about free testing. As I say, we published that back end of last week. It's all on the website. The map on the right is those high-risk counties. So Norfolk, Suffolk, Essex, Kent and East Sussex. It's available for movements to live outside of those counties, but we've also added in markets in those counties because you can't tell who's going to buy those animals. So even if those animals were sold within the county, you are eligible for a free test prior to sending them to that market because they might go outside. And it also includes, if you like, a temporary move to a show and back again. So that's also eligible if you were moving animals from those counties to a show. So you can book a free test and the free sampling by contacting Farm Care, and the number's up there, it's on the website, or sending them an email. The VDP vet or the contracted vet will come out, take those samples and send them to either Pirbright, who's the National Reference Lab, or to APHA, who's our official lab, and we'll balance supply and demand by sending it to which one of those is most appropriate. And we'll be testing by PCR. We're only testing by PCR. We're not testing by serology. Just a reminder to people, it does take time to arrange those visits. And obviously it takes time to get the lab results tested and sent back to you. So allow at least 10 working days before your the planned movement. Once the samples have been taken and sent to the lab, typically you should get them back in 3 working days, but perhaps allow up to 5 days. So that really means plan in advance, get it all booked in, and please take advantage of it. It will, one, you'll be aware, and also your customers and clients will also be aware, and will minimize the risk of spreading undetected disease. So what are we doing between now and when it arrives? Well, it's all about comms, and this is another example of comms raising awareness. We've produced a bunch of leaflets, a bunch of posters. The one on the right is an example of that. They're all available on the website if you want to download them, if you want to put them up in your vet practice, or email them out or whatever, or print them out, please do so. And what we're really wanting to do is just to raise awareness of what the clinical signs are, and to remind farmers and your farming clients, if you're a vet, just to get ahead of the game, think through what might happen if you are in a zone. It won't be as restrictive as those temporary control zones, but if you are in a CZ, there will be licensing. We will use general licenses where we can. We intend to use general licenses to move to slaughter rather than individual licenses, but those general licenses will only be available to an abattoir that's designated. So check if your normal abattoir, your normal slaughterhouse is designated. They're all listed on gov.uk. There's 29 of them currently designated. If you're a sheep producer, be particularly careful about checking, because whilst we've got something like 64% of cattle slaughterhouses signed up, we've only got something like 32% of sheep slaughterhouses signed up. So you won't be allowed to send finished animals to an abattoir unless it's designated. So we're working with abattoirs, but also put some pressure in the nicest possible sense on your supplier or your buyer to get designated. Please register all your temporary land. it's much easier for us to do the tracings and the ID and working out where animals may have been moved to if it's all registered, even those temporary land associations and those short-term buildings, even if it's just a bit of land, a field down the road that you have under a gentleman's agreement. Please get them registered so that it's all on our map, so that we know where to do that surveillance. It'll be much quicker for all of us. And just a reminder, source responsibly, whether that be an import or whether it be buying in from another farmer. If it's from these high risk counties, you can ask for a test, and just buyer beware, I guess. Vaccination, not a huge amount I can say on that. There are no authorized vaccines in the UK. In fact, there's no authorized vaccines anywhere in Europe either. There are 3 ways that you can use vaccines legally. So you can have a full marketing authorization. That's how most of your endemic vaccines are bought and prescribed. That takes a long time to get it firstly authorized, but also you need quite a lot of evidence based and a dossier of information for VMD to look through. We've had webinars on that, so a lot of this, I know. But there is the option for what we call a provisional market authorization. That's where you've got a limited dossier of information, but still sufficient information for the Veterinary Medicines Directorate to be able to issue that authorization, even though it's provisional. And that still remains our preferred option for use. Or there is this emergency use, we call it Schedule 4. I think it's Article 110 in Europe. And it's this third option that the Netherlands and Belgium have used to allow the use of vaccines in those countries. It means that the evidence base is not fully there, and so there are usually some additional controls. So in the Netherlands, for example, it not only has to be prescribed by a vet, but it has to be administered by a vet, and then it has to be fully recorded. Whereas if it were a PMA, it's likely that farmers could apply it, inject it themselves. Obviously, it's still going to be a prescription only medicine, so it would still have to be prescribed. So we're working with the vaccine manufacturers. You may or may not know, but we put out what we call a PRN, a PIN, a prior information note, to try and get more information from these vaccine manufacturers. We've had responses from 5 different companies, of which 3 have said that they're obviously close to market, and they are the 3 that have got that emergency use authorization in the Netherlands. So it's now up to 3 in the Netherlands and 1 in Belgium, and I would expect Germany probably to be online fairly soon, I would imagine, in that space. It would be very difficult for us at the moment to go down that route through this pre-election period, because it would need the Secretary of State to make a specific judgment on that. And I think that's probably all I can say on vaccines. So please don't ask me anything more, but please put your questions in the chat. Obviously, we want a safe and efficacious vaccine to allow its use. So you've probably heard more than enough from me already, but just closing thoughts. So we'll always apply our controls based on the best scientific, veterinary and epidemiological evidence. We work really closely with our core group, and a number of colleagues sit on that core group, including BCVA. Gareth kindly sits on that core group for us, as does NFU, NSA, NBA, NFU, etc. The disease control measures we put in place will depend on when we get that first incursion, and so obviously if it were to incur really late in the year, then it would be quite different from an incursion in the next few months. We don't think do nothing is an option in the early stages of an outbreak for the reasons I've described. I think the severity of the clinical disease observed will influence how we move forward, the sorts of size of zones and the amount of licensing that we're prepared to allow, and the more severe those clinical signs. So if it were the sorts of really bad clinical signs that we've seen in sheep in the Netherlands and the sorts of production losses we've seen in some of the dairy cows, we're far more likely to be stringent in terms of those controls, and much more restrictive. If it's much less, the clinical signs are much less, then we'll be more, we'll treat it more like a category A or a B or C disease, like they do in continental Europe. We do hope that vaccination will dampen down disease, in Northern Europe, and so any vaccination they do will help in terms of that, reducing the amount of infection circulating. But remember, it's not like a foot and mouth disease. There is no requirement on member states to put in place disease control measures or to stamp it out. And you will have seen that very few of them are actively looking to stamp it out. France, for example, BTV-8 and BTV-4 is now considered endemic, and so the control there is vaccination. And I imagine we'll be moving to that situation in other countries in Northern Europe. We'd still like to keep it out, but let's see where we go. We will keep it a notifiable disease. In England, we've already made legislative changes to make much more discretion around disease control measures, so we don't have to put in place these control zones like we had to prior to last year. So we have much more flexibility built in there. We can allow some movements within control zones. We can allow movements out of those control zones now. So we've responded to that threat by making legislative changes. And really, I suppose the final thing is, we're all assuming it's going to be BTV-3, but it could be BTV-8, it could be BTV-4, or it could be AHDB. Other diseases are available, and we shouldn't just be single focused on BTV-3. As vets and animal keepers, we've just got to be aware of anything unusual. God forbid it could be H5N1 in dairy cattle. Anything is possible. Please be vigilant, and the vets amongst you, you're our eyes and ears, and please work with your farming clients to work with us. And that is all I wanted to say. I think I can't even move it on. Oop, there we go.
Ending on a really cheery note there, Gordon. Thank you.
It's my job.
Thank you, Gordon. That was absolutely brilliant. I think that was a great run through of it, of where it's come from and the reasons why it's been done in how it has. And yeah, I think that was really excellent. We've had quite a few questions coming through, so I'm going to start asking a few of those. But just to say, any more questions, please keep pushing them through into the question box. We will try and answer as many as we can, and any that we can't answer, we will make sure get fed through to DEFRA. Okay, so I'm going to start with this one, which is about the free testing, Gordon. So free testing in high-risk counties, applicable to which farm species? So which animals can be tested in this scheme?
So all susceptible animals, so ruminants and camelids. So no restrictions on cattle or sheep, or obviously they're the main things. So yeah. All susceptible species.
All susceptible species. That's fantastic. Okay, so another one I've had here was maybe for you or Gareth. Either of you happy to answer this one. So Gordon, you mentioned about a third of the infected farms having clinical signs for BTV in the Netherlands. Was that sheep you were referring to, or was that cattle, or was that just across the whole lot?
So that was across the board. So that was just clinical versus picked up through surveillance. We do know that it's sheep are much more likely to show clinical signs and severe clinical signs. But well, Gareth the vet, but yeah. So that's those numbers. It was all reported, all confirmed cases.
Yeah, if I could
Gareth,
just add, I think it tends to affect sheep more than cattle. Cattle tend to be mainly because they're bigger, the means of spread. So you will get clinical signs in cattle, and that'll be, I think the Netherlands have been reporting things like milk drop up to about a third of production, which is recoverable. But the general pattern is that cattle tend to be if you like, the species that are the sort of virus generators, you might say. They're bigger and they can produce lots of virus, and so you need to control the disease in all species, because that could lead to further disease in sheep, for example.
brilliant. Thank you very much. I've got another question here. This one's about midges, so I don't know which of you wants to take this one, but it was a question about midge surveillance and whether there's any PCR testing of midges carried out for surveillance, or is it pointless once the temperature for replication in the vector is reached? Is that something that's done?
So I think if you look back at old webinars, Chris Sanders has probably answered this one, but we're not currently testing pools of midges by PCR. I think they have done some in the Netherlands, but the trouble is, if a negative result doesn't mean it's negative, if you see what I mean. So you've got to test an awful lot, and so it's far better to do the surveillance in the animal. It's more accurate to look in the animal than it is in the midge population.
Certainly. Okay, that's great. I've got one here about suitable treatment regimes for sheep affected by bluetongue. I think for that one, unless you want to take that, Gareth, we would probably advise people to go and have a look at the previous webinar that was specifically on bluetongue, clinical signs in sheep and the treatment experience in the Netherlands, and also an excellent in practice article that came out last month that also looked in quite some detail at how the Netherlands had gone about trying to treat clinically affected sheep, and the success or otherwise of the various treatments that they had used there. So unless either of you want to add anything on that.
No, those are the two go-tos, I think, and they've got as full information really as we've got.
Brilliant. That is great. Okay. Okay. Question here. I'm not sure if you'll be able to answer this, Gordon, but if disease is confirmed, would there be any action regarding wild deer movements among high or low risk areas? So wildlife restriction, I guess, is rather more challenging.
So I don't think there would be restrictions. Again, I think Chris Sanders probably sort of covered that in previous webinars. Clearly they are susceptible, but they're not thought to be an important reservoir for onward transmission. So yes, they can be infected, but the cattle are the bigger concern. Well, obviously sheep as well, but they're far more likely to be significant in the onward transmission and the epidemiology of an outbreak.
Okay, excellent. I've got one here. Not a question, just an encouragement for farmers in the eastern counties to go ahead and register to use the new licensing service. Details on the gov.uk bluetongue page. So yeah, just really another kind of call to action. Let's get ready for if and when this does happen. So yeah, get registered now and familiar with the new licensing service that's there. it is live already, and it would be good for everybody to be registered for that and have that already there in their back pocket. And as you said as well, Gordon, make sure that everybody's registered those bits of land that perhaps they don't really consider as part of their farm, or that they put some animals on. Brilliant. Okay. What else have we got here? Sorry, I'm just looking through all of my questions. I've got a couple about vaccination, so I'm going to avoid those just for the minute. And another one, just a clarification around the free testing, Gordon. Really just around timeframes. So it's really notifying in time, isn't it? So it's not necessarily the date of the testing, but it's the notice period for the testing. Is that
yes? So
correct?
So you want to allow, ideally the test is 5 days before the actual move. That allows you to get the sample, it to be sampled, got to the lab, and you get the results back before you move them. Clearly, this is voluntary testing. You can move them beforehand if for some reason there is a delay. So this is not compulsory testing. There is no movement restrictions on them, but obviously best to wait till you get the results. And so the longer, if you know when the move or the market is book it up now, so that the farm care vet can actually get it booked in, but book it for 5 days before the move, as close to the move as you can, if you see what I mean. Because obviously if you tested it today and you were moving in 2 weeks time, it's only as good as today.
Yeah, of course. So trying to get it as close to the move as possible, but whilst giving sufficient time to get those results back. Yes. But really it's the notice period of getting those samples taken that's the critical.
Booking in the sampling.
Yeah, absolutely. So as soon as you're aware that you're going to want to move animals, get it booked.
And just a reminder, this is, you will need to have the facilities for the testing, and you'll need the handling there as well. It'll be a private vet contracted by APHA that comes to take the sampling. There won't be the full APHA infrastructure to round up and help. We would expect those animals to be presented for sampling in appropriate safe handling facilities.
Yeah, of course, that's a really good point. Absolutely. Okay, I've got one here. I'm a little confused by it. I'll do my best. It's actually referring to Schmallenberg. So I think it's asking about Schmallenberg testing, and whether that is available throughout GB or in the high risk areas, given that BTV and Schmallenberg can be confused, I think is the question. So whether there's any Schmallenberg testing that should be done alongside the BTV testing, I'm guessing is the question. Gareth, you have a thought on that?
Yeah, as I think, and Gordon, correct me if you know otherwise. I think that the cattle expert group and the small ruminant expert groups for APHA have agreed to support testing for Schmallenberg, and the reason for that is there's been that's another midge-borne disease that behaves in a sort of cyclical nature, and that's we don't fully understand the reasons for that, but some of it will be to do with how the flock and herd immunity wanes over a period of years. But we tend to see a peak in cases every sort of 4 or 5 years, and we've just had, or we are having, a peak. So in terms of, because of the concomitant risk with bluetongue potentially occurring at the same time, those groups are looking to have to support testing for Schmallenberg, and that would be across all countries.
Yeah.
I think it's across the piece, but it's through the veterinary investigation centres and through the surveillance system rather than free testing as such. So your private vet would submit a sample in the normal way through the the scanning surveillance system network.
Yeah.
Sure.
Yeah, and just to say, Schmallenberg is not notifiable, whereas, as we've already recorded, BTV is.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Okay, thank you. We've got one about post-movement testing.
I will
You
need to
need to leave.
leave fairly soon, but
Okay,
yeah,
one last question for you, Gordon, and then I'll let you go, I promise. So it's about post-movement testing. So if we were to have post-movement testing from animals in the high-risk area, how long after movement would that post-movement test be? Do you have to wait a certain amount of period after arrival?
So we'll only do post-movement testing after we've confirmed disease in the country. But clearly, and typically it's 6 to 10 days after the move. So normally around about the end of the standstill period, and that just gives sufficient time that if the animal would, because obviously it would have had a pre-movement test, or almost certainly had a pre-movement test, so it should have been negative at the point that it was sampled, but clearly a couple of days might have gone between the sample, and also it takes time for viremia to begin if it was bitten on the day that it left, if you see what I mean. So we normally say 6 to 10 days afterwards.
Perfect.
And
Thank you very much.
if we're a move out of the zone, then that animal would be placed under restriction at the destination premises until it tests negative.
Until a clear test. Yeah. Okay, perfect. Thank you so much, Gordon. That's been wonderful, and I think you've provided some really great clarity to a situation that could move very quickly in future. But we know where the policies come from, and we've got a really good idea of how it's likely to unfold as time goes on. And we really do appreciate you coming, especially given everything that's going on at the moment, and answering those questions for us. So thank you so much. Much appreciated.
No problem. Thank you very much, and I'll say goodbye. Thanks a lot.
Thanks,
Bye.
Gordon. Appreciate that. Okay, I don't have any more technical bluetongue type questions for you here, Gareth. We've got a few more around vaccination, etc., but nothing that I think that we are in a position to answer here right now. I would just like to say again to encourage you, if you do have more questions, even if they are ones about policy, they're about vaccination, they're about future things that might happen, please do put them in. We really do want to have those questions, and DEFRA are really keen to see those questions that are being asked. Even though they're maybe not in a position to answer any of them right now, they really want to know what's being asked so that they can prepare themselves for the post-election when they will be able to do more again. And yeah, just to say, Gareth, thank you very much as well for being here and bringing that kind of technical aspect into it as well. Really appreciate having your expertise here today. And just thank you all for attending. Hope you found it useful. I think it's been a really good, clear run through of the BTV framework. I know in the chat, the link to the Ruminant Health and Welfare Group bluetongue resource page has been put in there. And I would really encourage any of you, so there are previous webinar recordings on there, so there are various ones on midges, there's ones on the clinical disease, there's ones on potential treatments, etc. So anything that you're interested in there, I'm sure there'll be something within that page. And also that page is really the place to go to, where we will make sure that we do our best to keep you as up to date as we can, both with what's going on in Europe and what's going on in the UK. So really just a final thank you very much for coming along today. I hope you found it useful. You will all be forwarded a link to the recording, and the recording will be available on the Ruminant Health and Welfare Group website. So thank you very, very much for attending, and goodbye.